Miss Marple, and the last warning for Inspector Slack. Hello, friends. It's wonderful to have you with us at Warm Chapters. I'm Thomas, and thank you for joining me tonight. Let us know where you're listening from, and you enjoy cold winter days, or you already looking forward to the return of sunny ones. Don't forget to subscribe so you can return for new stories daily. Now get comfortable and enjoy the mystery. Chapter 1. Murmurs by the Bowling Green. Spring had come to street, merry me with its usual quiet insistence, bringing with it the sort of predictable pleasures that made village life both comfortable and, to those of a certain temperament, rather trying. The hedge along the high street had been trimmed to mathematical precision by Mr. Dreyer. Yeah, the elderly gardener who attended them for 40 years and considered any deviation from the traditional height to be a personal affront to order itself. The Women's Institute had held its annual cake competition in the parish hall, an event which had produced the usual careful compliments and the usual carefully concealed disappointments and reputations, as always. In St. Mary me were being quietly measured, weighed, and sometimes found wanting. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her drawing room with a piece of delicate knitting in her lap, reflected that there was something particularly satisfying about the rhythm of village life in springtime. The light through the windows had that clear, hopeful quality that made even the most ordinary objects seem somehow significant. A china shepherdess on the mantelpiece, a bowl of late daffodils, the comfortable clutter of a life well lived in one place. Through the open window came the gentle sound of voices from the bowling green, that stretch of immaculate grass that served as both recreation ground and social barometer for St. Mary Me's more established residents. Miss Marple's hearing, despite her advancing years, remained remarkably acute, and she could distinguish without difficulty the cheerful tones of Colonel Pertherbridge discussing his Alice with Dr. Haddock, and the more measured responses of Mr. Clement, the vicar's cousin, who was visiting for the season. What interested her more, however, was what she did not hear. Mrs. Finch, the village shopkeeper, was standing near the green with Mrs. Price Ridley, and neither woman was speaking. This in itself was remarkable, as Mrs. Finch possessed one of those comfortable, confidential voices that seemed designed by nature for the sharing of information, and Mrs. Price Ridley had never been known to miss an opportunity for social observation. Yet, there they stood, watching the bowlers with an intensity that suggested their minds were very far from the game. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. She had learned long ago that the most interesting truths revealed themselves not in what people said, but in the silences between their words. The previous Tuesday, an event had occurred that had sent ripples through the village, though to an outsider it might have seemed hardly worth noticing. A letter had arrived at the vicarage, typewritten and unsigned, suggesting in carefully vague terms that someone of authority in St. Mary Me had abused their position in a manner that, while perhaps not technically unlawful, reflects poorly on the trust placed in them by this community. The letter had named no names, it had made no specific accusations, and yet it had somehow managed to create an atmosphere of unease that hung over the village like morning mist. Reverend Clementson Baldwin, a gentle soul who found conflict of any kind deeply distressing, had shown the letter to his wife, who had immediately declared it to be the work of a troublemaker. Mrs. St. Aldwyn, a practical woman with firm views on most subjects, had then rather unfortunately mentioned it to Mrs. Bantry during a chance meeting at the greengrocer's, and from there the knowledge had spread through St. Mary Me with the inexorable thoroughness of water finding its way through limestone. The curious thing, Miss Marple reflected, it was not that people were discussing the letter, but that they were so carefully not discussing it, or rather, they were discussing everything around it, while avoiding any direct mention of its contents or implications. Inspector Slack, Street, Mary Me's representative of law and order, had been informed of the letter's existence by Reverend Saint himself. The inspector was a large, red-faced man, with a manner that combined official authority with personal impatience in roughly equal measure. He had examined the letter with the air of a man who has better things to do, pronounced it the work of a crank, and advised the vicar to pay it no mind whatsoever. Probably some disappointed busybody with too much time and too little sense, he had declared, his voice carrying clearly through the vicarage study and into the hall where the daily woman was dusting with unusual slowness. We get this sort of thing now and again. Anonymous letters. Cowardly business. Nothing to be done about it, really, unless they become threatening, which this isn't. Just vague nonsense. Miss Marple, who had heard this account from the daily woman's sister-in-law, found the inspector's dismissal interesting. She had known Inspector Slack for some years now, and while she would never have described him as a subtle man, he was not generally a foolish one. His very vehemence in dismissing the letter suggested to her experienced eye that he was rather more disturbed by it than he wished to appear. The bowling green had emptied now, the players dispersing to their various homes for tea. Miss Marple watched as Mrs. Finch and Mrs. Price Ridley parted with a brief nod. I still, without having exchanged more than a few words. She observed the way Mrs. Finch glanced back toward the vicarage before turning down the lane, and the way Mrs. Price Ridley's hand went to her pearls in that particular gesture that, in her case, always indicated moral uncertainty. Dear me, thought Miss Marple, how very interesting. She had seen this sort of thing before, of course. Years ago, in another village where she had spent a summer visiting a cousin, there had been a similar incident involving an anonymous letter and a schoolmaster. The letter had accused no one directly, but had hinted at improprieties. The remarkable thing had been watching how people's behavior changed, not because they knew anything specific, but because they feared being associated with whatever the letter implied. Innocent people had begun to act guilty, and guilty people had become ostentatiously virtuous, and in the end, the whole affair had created far more trouble than any actual wrongdoing might have done. The question was whether the same pattern was repeating itself here in St. Mary Me. A knock at the door interrupted her reflections. Her maid, Agnes, appeared with a slight frown. Miss Calthorpe to see you, Mum. I've shown her into the morning room. Miss Calthorpe. Now, that was interesting indeed. Ella Lenana Calthorpe had been the village school teacher for nearly 30 years before her retirement 5 years ago. She was a woman of perhaps 60, tall and spare, with a sort of upright carriage that suggested both good breeding and considerable self-discipline. She lived alone in a neat cottage on the edge of the village and was known for her intelligence, her discretion, and her rather formidable standards in matters of grammar and department. She was not, however, known for making social calls, particularly not in the late afternoon, when most of St. Mary Me was engaged in the pleasant ritual of tea, and Miss Marple set aside her knitting and made her way to the morning room, where she found Miss Cal standing by the window, her gloved hands clasped before her. The former schoolteacher turned as Miss Marple entered, and there was something in her expression that spoke of careful resolution, as though she had nerved herself to a difficult task. Miss Marple, how kind of you to see me without notice. My dear Miss Calthorpe, you are always welcome. Please do sit down. Agnes will bring tea directly. And they settled into the comfortable chairs, and Miss Marple waited with the patience that comes from long experience. People told you things when they were ready, and not a moment before. Pressing them only made them retreat into formality. Miss Calthorpe smoothed her skirt, a gesture that portrayed more nervousness than her calm expression revealed. "I expect you have heard about the letter that arrived at the vicarage." I had heard something to that effect. "Yes, the village is unsettled. I can see it in small ways. Mrs. Finch was quite short with a customer this morning, most unlike her. And at the post office, Mrs. Ridgeway seemed positively anxious when I collected my pension." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. "The difficulty," Miss Calthorpe continued, choosing her words with care, "is that when no specific accusation is made, and everyone fills in the blanks according to their own assumptions, and those assumptions, I fear, are maybe leading people to behave in ways that are quite divorced from common sense. You speak as though you have observed something specific." Miss Calthorpe met her eyes directly. "I have observed that Inspector Slack, who's normally quite confident in his own judgments, has become suddenly concerned with making amends for past, shall we say, errors in judgment. Small errors perhaps, but the timing is suggestive. Suggestive of what, I wonder? That he believes the letter refers to him, and that he is attempting to forestall criticism by demonstrating reformed behaviour." Miss Marple considered this. That would suggest the letter has achieved its purpose, even if unintentionally. Perhaps Miss Calthorpe's voice was measured, or perhaps it has set in motion something that was never intended at all. She rose to leave, declining the offer of tea with polite regret. At the door, she paused. "Miss Marple, I have always believed that truth is better than speculation, and that direct address is kinder than anonymous suggestion. But I also know that sometimes people require a gentle warning before they can see the path they're on. I hope that St. Mary Me will remember that distinction." When she had gone, Miss Marple returned to her drawing room and took up her knitting once more. The shadows were lengthening across the lawn, and a blackbird was singing in the apple tree. She thought about warnings and about the different ways people tried to correct behaviour they found troubling. Some confronted directly, some gossiped in corners, and some, it seemed, wrote careful letters that said everything and nothing. The question that interested her most, however, was not who had written the letter, though that was certainly worth knowing. It was whether the letter had been written out of malice or out of something rather more complicated, and whether Inspector Slack would prove capable of understanding the difference. Chapter 2. An envelope arriving without a stamp. The morning after Miss Callop's visit found Miss Marple engaged in one of those seemingly inconsequential activities that nevertheless provided her with considerable pleasure. She was arranging a V of white lilac from her garden, adjusting each stem with the careful attention that some people reserved for matters of considerably greater importance. The scent filled the drawing room with a particular sweetness that belonged exclusively to late spring, and through the window she could see the vicar making his way up her front path, with the slightly hesitant gait of a man who is not entirely certain of his welcome. Reverend Clement Street was a tall, thin gentleman of perhaps 50 years, and with a kind of mild and a scholarly face that suggested he would have been far happier in a university library than in a parish requiring the management of human souls with all their attendant complications. His wife possessed the practical nature he lacked, and between them they had managed the spiritual and temporal affairs of St. Mary Me for nearly a decade with reasonable success and only occasional difficulty. Miss Marple sat down the vase and moved to greet him, and noting as she did so that he carried a manila folder with something of the careful delicacy one might employ when handling a dead mouse. "My dear vicar, what a pleasant surprise. Do come in. Miss Marple, I hope I'm not intruding. I know it's rather early for calls, but I found myself quite unable to settle to my sermon, and I thought perhaps you might spare me a few moments." They settled in the morning room, where the sunlight fell in pleasant squares across the carpet, and Agnes brought tea without being asked, a habit born of long service and shrewd observation, and the vicar accepted a cup with visible relief. "It's about the letter," he said at last, after a silence that had stretched just slightly beyond comfort, "the one that arrived on Tuesday. I know I ought to simply disregard it, as Inspector Slack advised. He was quite firm on that point, and yet I find it weighing on my mind in a most disturbing way." And Miss Marple poured milk into her own tea with steady hands. "I imagine that was rather the intention. You think it was meant to disturb?" "I think," said Miss Marple carefully, "that letters of that nature are very rarely written without purpose. Whether the purpose is malicious or otherwise is, of course, another question entirely." The vicar opened the manila folder and withdrew a single sheet of paper, which he passed to Miss Marple with an expression of distaste. "My wife suggested I show it to you. She said that if anyone could make sense of such a thing, it would be you." The letter was typed on good quality paper, the sort one might purchase at a stationer's in a larger town, rather than from Mrs. Finch's modest stock at the village shop. The typewriter had been well maintained, producing clear, even letters without the irregular spacing that often betrayed an old or poorly adjusted machine. The message itself was brief, to whom it may concern. "It has come to my attention that a person of authority in this village has abused their position in a manner that, while perhaps not technically unlawful, reflects poorly on the trust placed in them by this community. I write not to accuse, but to warn. There is still time for amends to be made quietly and with dignity. This is the last such warning that will be offered." Miss Marple read it through twice, her blue eyes thoughtful behind her spectacles. "May I ask how this was delivered?" That's one of the peculiar things," the vicar said, leaning forward slightly. "It wasn't posted in the usual way. Mrs. Ridgeway mentioned when I collected some parcels at the post office yesterday that she hadn't seen any such letter pass through her hands. She was quite definite about it. Said she would have remembered given the type address. Then how did it arrive? It was found in the parish letterbox. You know, the one attached to the wall beside the church gate, and it's emptied every morning by our Vija, Mr. Pollock, who brings any correspondence to the vicarage. He found this on Wednesday morning, placed among the usual notices and requests for prayers, but there was no stamp, you see. It had been placed there by hand, presumably during the night." Miss Marple examined the envelope more closely. It was addressed simply to the vicar, St. Mary Me, in the same typewritten hand as the letter itself. No stamp, as the vicar had said, and no postmark. That suggests someone local," she observed. "Someone familiar enough with the village to know about the parish letterbox, and confident enough to approach it without being seen. Or someone who wished to ensure the letter couldn't be traced through the postal system," the vicar added with a flash of insight that showed he was not entirely without worldly understanding. "Quite so, though I wonder whether that demonstrates cunning or simply caution." And Miss Marple set the letter aside and reached for the teapot. "Tell me, vicar, have you noticed any change in the village since this arrived? In the way people speak to one another, perhaps, or in the general atmosphere?" The vicar's expression became troubled. "That's what disturbs me most. I think people have been behaving rather oddly." Mrs. Finch declined to speculate about the affair when Mrs. Bantry attempted to discuss it in the shop yesterday. Can you imagine? Mrs. Finch declining to discuss anything. And then, at the Women's Institute meeting on Wednesday evening, there was the most extraordinary scene. Do tell. Mrs. Price Ridley stood up during the general business and suggested that the Institute make a formal statement expressing confidence in all village officials. She was quite emphatic about it, though no one had suggested any lack of confidence in the first place. Miss Hartnell seconded the motion, and it was carried, but the whole thing felt rather like closing the stable door before anyone had even noticed there was a horse. Miss Marple smiled faintly. How very interesting. And Inspector Slack has been behaving in the most peculiar manner. On Thursday morning, he made a point of apologizing to Mr. Breyer, the school caretaker, for having wrongly suspected him of poaching last winter. Apologized publicly in front of half the village at the butcher shop. Mr. Breyer was quite taken aback, and he'd never even known the inspector suspected him in the first place. Had there been any poaching? A few rabbits went missing from Colonel Petherbridge's estate, but nothing was ever proven, and the matter was dropped months ago. The inspector's sudden desire to make amends struck everyone as rather odd given the circumstances. Miss Marple considered this information while she sipped her tea. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, though the picture was not yet complete. Our Inspector Slack's behaviour suggested he believed the letter referred to him. The Ville's collective nervousness suggested that others believed the same, or at least feared they might be implicated, and the careful wording of the letter itself suggested an author who was educated, restrained, and precise in their intentions. Vicer, you mentioned the quality of the paper. May I ask whether you've observed anything else about the letter that seemed noteworthy? He frowned, thinking, and the phrasing is rather formal, isn't it? Not the sort of language one would expect from someone writing in anger or spite. It reads almost like an official communication, except that official communications don't generally arrive anonymously in parish letterboxes. No, indeed. And the reference to the last such warning suggests there may have been previous communications. Though you've received nothing of the sort, nothing at all, I would certainly have remembered, and then perhaps the warning was delivered in some other form. Or perhaps the author is simply implying a history that doesn't exist in order to create a greater sense of urgency. The Vicer looked miserable. What do you think I ought to do, Miss Marple? Mrs. St. Aldwyn believes I should burn the letter and forget about it. She says it's only giving power to mischief makers, but I can't shake the feeling that ignoring it entirely would be wrong. What if someone genuinely has behaved badly, and this is an attempt to address it without causing public scandal? That is the difficulty with anonymous communications, Miss Marple said gently. They deny the accused any opportunity to respond in, when they deny the accuser any claim to moral authority. One cannot have justice without honesty, and there is nothing honest about refusing to attach one's name to one's accusations. But if the accusation is true, then the proper course would be to address it directly through the appropriate channels, not to hint and suggest and create an atmosphere of suspicion that touches everyone equally, guilty and innocent alike. The vicar sighed and retrieved the letter, folding it carefully back into the manila folder. I suppose you're right, though I confess I shall continue to wonder who wrote it and why, and whether they meant well or ill by it. After he'd gone, Miss Marple sat for some time in quiet thought. The letter troubled her, then not because of what it said, but because of what it revealed about the currents running beneath St. Mary Mead's placid surface. Someone in the village felt strongly enough about Inspector Slack's conduct to compose a careful warning. Others felt nervous enough to distance themselves from gossip or to make public declarations of support. And Inspector Slack himself was attempting to rewrite recent history and making amends for actions that may or may not have required amendment. The pattern reminded her of something, though she could not immediately recall what. It nagged at the edge of her memory like a name one has temporarily forgotten. She rose and moved to her small writing desk, where she kept a diary of village events. Not a personal diary, but rather a chronicle of births, deaths, marriages, and the smaller occurrences that marked the passage of time in St. Mary Me. So she paged back through the entries for the previous autumn and winter, looking for any mention of Inspector Slack. There it was. November. Inspector Slack investigating disappearance of rabbits from Colonel P, the Bridges estate. Several men questioned, including Mr. Breyer and young Tommy Mills. And then in December, matter of missing rabbits appears to have been resolved quietly. No charges brought. She thought about Mr. Breyer, a quiet and dignified man who took pride in his work maintaining the school buildings. To be questioned about theft, even if the questioning led nowhere, would have been deeply humiliating for a man of his temperament. And if Inspector Slack had been heavy-handed in his approach, as he sometimes was, it might well have left wounds that required more than a belated apology to heal. But was that sufficient cause for an anonymous letter? Or was it merely one example of a larger pattern of behaviour? Miss Marple closed the diary and returned it to the desk. The afternoon stretched before her, and she had planned to do a little gardening. But as she tied on her gardening hat and collected her secrets, she found her thoughts returning again and again to that careful typed letter. Someone in St. Mary Me was watching. Someone was keeping track of injustices large and small, and someone had decided that the time had come for a warning to be given, and the question was whether the warning would be heeded, or whether it would simply create more trouble than it prevented. Chapter 3. An Unrequested Apology. Miss Marple had always held the view that the butcher shop on a Friday morning provided one of the most reliable opportunities for observing the true nature of village society. There was something about the selection of a joint of meat that brought out both the practical and the pretentious in people. And Mr. Gudgeon, who had presided over the shop for 30 years, possessed the sort of diplomatic manner that encouraged confidences while appearing to do nothing more than recommend lamb over beef. It was therefore with a sense of mild anticipation that Miss Marple made her way down the high street on Friday morning, her shopping basket over her arm, and her mind still occupied with the peculiar matter of the anonymous letter. The spring sunshine was warm on her face, and she exchanged pleasant greetings with several villagers as she passed, noting as she did so that Mrs. Price Ridley appeared rather more harried than usual, and that young Tommy Mills was whistling as he delivered groceries for his mother's shop with considerably less enthusiasm than the tune suggested. The butcher shop was moderately crowded when she arrived, which was precisely what she had hoped. Mrs. Bantry was examining a leg of lamb with a critical eye of someone who had been disappointed by lamb before and was determined not to repeat the experience. Miss Hartnell stood near the counter discussing the relative merits of pork chops, and Mr. Breyer, the school caretaker, was waiting quietly near the door with the patient demeanour of a man accustomed to waiting. It was Mr. Breyer's presence that interested Miss Marple most particularly. He was a man of perhaps 55 with greying hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of many years spent outdoors. His hands, she noticed, were scrupulously clean, despite the fact that his work frequently involved cold scuttles and dustbins, and his clothes, though worn, were carefully mended and pressed. He carried himself with a certain quiet dignity that Miss Marple had always found rather touching. She had known him slightly for several years, primarily through his wife, who occasionally helped with the church flowers, and she knew him to be a conscientious man who took pride in keeping the school buildings in good repair. The thought of Inspector Slack subjecting such a person to questioning about stolen rabbits struck her as particularly unfortunate. Mrs. Bantry, having secured her lamb to her satisfaction, moved toward the door and paused to greet Miss Marple with a sort of conspiratorial expression that suggested she had information to impart. "My dear Jane, have you heard the latest, the most extraordinary scene yesterday afternoon right here in this very shop? I wasn't present myself, you understand, but Mrs. Gudgeon told me all about it." Miss Marple murmured something non-committal, and Mrs. Bantry continued with evident relish. Inspector Slack came in to collect an order, and Mr. Briar happened to be here at the same time, and the inspector, bold as brass, walks up to him and says, in front of everyone, that he wished to apologize for having suspected him wrongly about those rabbits back in the winter, said he'd been hasty in his judgment, and that Mr. Briar was owed an apology. "How very handsome of the inspector," Miss Marple observed. "Handsome? I suppose so, though the timing was rather peculiar. Why apologize now, months after the fact, and why in such a public manner?" Poor Mr. Briar hardly knew where to look. He mumbled something about there being no offence taken and tried to leave, but the inspector kept going on about it, saying how important it was for a man in his position to admit when he had made an error. Miss Marple glanced toward Mr. Briar, who was still waiting with admirable patience. How did Mr. Briar respond? That's just it. He barely responded at all, simply said it was all forgotten and tried to change the subject, but the inspector seemed almost determined to make a production of it, and Mrs. Gudgeon said it was most uncomfortable for everyone present. After Mrs. Bantry had departed, Miss Marple approached Mr. Gudgeon's counter and placed her order, then turned as if by chance to address Mr. Briar. "Good morning, Mr. Briar. I trust all is well at the school. I noticed the hedges along the school lane looking particularly tidy." Mr. Briar's face softened slightly. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Yes, thank you. I gave them a trim last week. I can't have the children running into overgrown bushes on their way to lessons. I'm sure their parents appreciate your conscientiousness. The school is fortunate to have someone who takes such care with the grounds." A faint colour rose in his cheeks. "It's only what's right, miss. A place where children learn ought to be kept proper and respectable." Miss Marple collected her wrapped parcel from Mr. Gudgeon and moved toward the door, pausing as though a thought had just occurred to her. "I understand. Inspector Slack spoke to you yesterday. I do hope there wasn't any difficulty." Mr. Briar's expression became carefully neutral. "No difficulty, miss. The inspector was making apologies for something that happened back in the winter, though I'm sure I never held it against him. A man in his position has to ask questions, and sometimes the questions fall where they're not deserved. It's the nature of the work, I suppose. Still, it must have been uncomfortable at the time." And he looked down at his hands. "It wasn't pleasant. I'll not deny that. Being pulled aside and questioned about theft with half the village watching. My wife took it hard. She's a proud woman, and to have people thinking we might be the sort to take what wasn't ours." He paused, then seemed to recollect himself. "But that's all past now. The inspector has made his apology, and I've accepted it, and there's an end to it." "Of course," Miss Marple said gently, "though I imagine the apology might have been more welcome if it had been offered privately rather than in front of an audience." Mr. Briar met her eyes, and for a moment she saw a flash of something that might have been anger or might simply have been pain. "That's what struck me as odd, if you'll forgive my saying so. If a man wants to make amends, seems to me it's kinder to do it quietly. Making a show of it in front of others, well, It almost felt like he was apologizing for his own benefit rather than mine. This observation, delivered in Mr. Briar's quiet, measured tones, struck Miss Marple as remarkably perceptive. "You're quite right," she said. "A true apology is meant to heal a wound, not to advertise one's own virtue." After leaving the butcher shop, Miss Marple made her way slowly home, her mind turning over this new information. Inspector Slack's public apology had clearly been prompted by the anonymous letter, but the manner of it suggested something rather more complicated than simple contrition. He was attempting, she thought, to control a narrative before it could form, to demonstrate reformed behavior before anyone could formally accuse him of requiring reform. The difficulty was that in doing so, he had actually made the situation worse. Mr. Briar, we, who had evidently been prepared to forget the whole unpleasant business, had been forced to remember it in front of witnesses, and the apology had reopened a wound rather than healing it, and had done so in a way that served the inspector's interests more than Mr. Briar's dignity. Back in her drawing room, Miss Marple settled into her favourite chair and took up her knitting, but her fingers moved mechanically while her thoughts remained elsewhere. She recalled a situation many years ago involving a young curate who had made a series of social blunders and then attempted to correct them through ever more elaborate apologies, each of which had only drawn more attention to his original errors. The curate had meant well, but had lacked the wisdom to understand that sometimes the kindest course was simply to behave better going forward, without making a performance of one's reformation. Inspector Slack, it seemed, was falling into a similar pattern. The anonymous letter had touched a nerve, and rather than reflecting quietly on whether its implications were justified, he was attempting to demonstrate publicly that he was a reasonable man capable of admitting his mistakes. But the performance itself undermined his purpose, making him appear not humble, but anxious. The question that interested Miss Marple was whether this anxiety was rooted in genuine guilt or simply in wounded pride. Had Inspector Slack actually abused his position in some meaningful way? Or was he simply a man whose manner was sometimes brusque and whose judgment was occasionally hasty, and the distinction mattered because it would determine whether the anonymous letter was a justified warning or merely an attempt to punish someone for being insufficiently tactful? She thought about Mr. Briar's quiet dignity and his wife's wounded pride. She thought about the winter months when the investigation into the missing rabbits had cast a shadow over their reputation. She thought about how it must have felt to be suspected of theft by the very person meant to uphold justice in the community. And she thought about the phrase in the letter, while perhaps not technically unlawful, reflects poorly on the trust placed in them by this community. Wrongly suspecting someone of poaching was certainly not unlawful. Police officers made errors of judgment regularly, and provided they did not act maliciously, and such errors were generally accepted as an unfortunate but inevitable part of their work. But there was a difference between an error of judgment and a pattern of careless authority, between making a mistake and failing to consider the human cost of one's mistakes. The anonymous letter, Miss Marple reflected, had been carefully worded to suggest the latter rather than the former. Not a single incident, but a pattern. Not an accident, but a habit. For through the window, she could see Inspector Slack himself walking past her gate, his shoulders squared, and his chin raised in that particular way men had, when they were attempting to project confidence they did not entirely feel. He did not glance toward her house, but there was something in his gait that suggested he was very much aware of being observed. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. The inspector was making amends that had not been requested, apologizing for offences that had supposedly been forgotten, and performing his contrition for an audience that had not asked to witness it. all of which suggested that the anonymous letter had achieved precisely what its author intended, not to punish, but to make Inspector Slack acutely conscious of how his actions appeared to others. Whether that consciousness would lead to genuine reform or merely to more elaborate performances remained to be seen. Chapter 4. The Fastener on Mrs. and Ridgeway's Handbag. The post office in St. Mary-me occupied a corner of what had once been a rather grand Georgian house, though time and necessity had transformed it into a practical establishment serving the village's daily needs. Mrs. Ridgeway, the postmistress, presided over her domain with the efficiency of long practice and the discretion that her position required. She was a woman of middle years with sharp eyes and an excellent memory for faces, dates, and the small details that others might overlook. Miss Marple had known her for many years and had always found hers to be reliable in matters both postal and personal. It was therefore with a particular purpose in mind that Miss Marple made her way to the post office on Saturday morning, ostensibly to purchase stamps, but in reality to pursue a question that had been troubling her since her conversation with the vicar, and the morning was fine with a light breeze that carried the scent of apple blossoms from the rectory garden. Miss Marple walked slowly, as befitted her years, but her mind was working with considerable speed. If the anonymous letter had not passed through the regular mail, as Mrs. Ridgeway had indicated to the vicar, then its delivery had required both local knowledge and careful planning. Someone had approached the parish letterbox after dark, typed envelope in hand, and placed it among the usual notices and prayer requests, with the confidence of knowing it would be found and delivered to its intended recipient. The post office was empty when she arrived, which was fortunate. Mrs. Ridgeway looked up from sorting a stack of parcels and smiled with genuine warmth. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Lovely day, isn't it? What can I do for you?" "Good morning, Mrs. Ridgeway. I'd like a book of stamps, please. The commemorative ones, if you have them." While Mrs. Ridgeway retrieved the stamps from the drawer behind the counter, Miss Marple allowed her gaze to wander casually around the familiar space. The post office had changed very little over the years, which was one of its comforts. The same wooden counter polished by decades of hands. The same notices pinned to the board advertising church fetes and rooms to let the same sense of order and purpose. "There you are," Mrs. Ridgeway said, placing the book of stamps on the counter. "A lovely design this time, don't you think? Flowers of the British countryside." "Charming," Miss Marple agreed, examining them with appropriate interest. She opened her handbag to retrieve her purse, then paused as though struck by a thought. "Mrs. Ridgeway, I hope you won't think me forward, but I wondered whether I might ask you something rather particular." Mrs. Ridgeway's expression became alert but cautious. "Of course, Miss Marple, though I'm not sure what help I can be. It's about the letter that was delivered to the vicarage earlier this week, the one that wasn't posted through the regular mail." A faint colour rose in Mrs. Ridgeway's cheeks. "Oh, that business. Rather awkward, isn't it? The vicar showed it to you then." "He did. He was concerned quite naturally, and thought I might have some perspective on the matter." Miss Marple paid for her stamps and returned her purse to her handbag, her movements unhurried. "You mentioned to him that it hadn't come through your hands, which struck me as rather significant. After all, you handle virtually every piece of correspondence that enters or leaves St. Mary-me." "That's true enough." Mrs. Ridgeway glanced toward the door, as though checking they would not be overheard. "I would have remembered processing a typed letter to the vicarage. We don't get many of those. Most of the vicar's mail is handwritten, you see, from parishioners or from the deceased. A typed letter stands out. so it was definitely placed in the parish letterbox by hand. Must have been. And that troubles me, Miss Marple, more than I like to say. Mrs. Ridgeway's fingers went to the clasp of her handbag which sat on the counter beside her, worrying at it in a gesture that betrayed considerable anxiety. Anonymous letters are a nasty business. They create suspicion where none ought to exist, and make people question things they'd never have thought twice about otherwise. And Miss Marple noticed the nervous gesture with interest. You seem rather more disturbed by this than I would have expected, if you'll forgive my observation. Mrs. Ridgeway's hand stilled. She looked at Miss Marple for a long moment, then sighed. I suppose there's no harm in telling you. You'll work it out anyway, knowing you. The thing is, I'm afraid people might think I had something to do with it. Why would anyone think that? Because of my position. I handle the mail, don't I? I see who writes to whom, who receives packages, who sends telegrams. If anyone in the village had access to addresses and knowledge of people's business, it would be me. She paused, her expression troubled, and because I was one of the people who heard about Mr. Briar being questioned last winter. My sister's boy works at the station, and he mentioned that the inspector had been rather harsh with Mr. Briar. Made assumptions without evidence, my nephew said. It bothered me at the time, but I didn't say anything. What could I say? It wasn't my place to criticize the inspector. But you remember it now? Yes. And when that letter appeared suggesting someone in authority had abused their position, well, naturally, I thought of that incident among others. But then I started to worry that people might assume I had written the letter, or given what I knew, and the fact that it bypassed the regular postal system. She released the clasp and folded her hands firmly on the counter. It's put me in a most uncomfortable position, Miss Marple. I don't want to be thought a troublemaker, but I also don't want to be suspected of something I didn't do. Miss Marple considered this carefully. Has anyone actually suggested you might have written it? Not in so many words, but I've noticed glances. Mrs. Finch asked me yesterday, very casually, whether I'd seen anyone near the parish letterbox on Tuesday evening, as though she was trying to determine whether I had an alibi. Mrs. Ridgeway's voice held a note of indignation. I've lived in this village for 23 years and never given anyone cause to doubt my integrity. And now I find myself wondering whether people are questioning my character simply because I happen to work with letters. What did you tell Mrs. Finch? The truth that I'd been home all evening with my husband working on the accounts from the shop. He'll vouch for that if anyone asks, though I hope it won't come to that. The door opened and Mrs. and Bantry entered with a cheerful greeting. Miss Marple collected her stamps and made her farewells, but as she stepped out into the sunshine, she reflected on what Mrs. Ridgeway had revealed. The postmistress was genuinely worried about being suspected, which suggested she had nothing to do with the letter's compositional delivery. But her mention of Inspector Slack's harsh treatment of Mr. Briar was interesting, as it confirmed that the incident had been observed and discussed by others beyond those directly involved. More significantly, it revealed that the anonymous letter had achieved another unintended consequence. It was making innocent people anxious about their own positions, causing them to justify themselves and establish alibis for actions they hadn't committed. Miss Marple walked slowly down the high street, her mind occupied with the accumulating details, and the letter had been typed on good paper with a well-maintained typewriter. It had been delivered by hand, suggesting local knowledge and access. It had been carefully worded to avoid specific accusations while implying a pattern of behavior, and it had created an atmosphere in which people were either defending Inspector Slack with unusual vigor or defending themselves against possible suspicion. She paused outside the chemist shop, where a small group had gathered near the entrance. Mrs. Grafton, the chemist's wife, was speaking in tones that carried clearly across the pavement. "I've always said Inspector Slack has a sensitive touch when it matters. People forget that he deals with difficult situations every day. A certain firmness is required in his line of work." This observation coming from Mrs. Grafton was remarkable in itself. The previous autumn, the inspector had investigated a minor theft at the chemist's and had questioned Mrs. Grafton with what she had at the time described as insufferable rudeness. She had complained about it for weeks afterward. He is telling anyone who would listen that the inspector treated her like a common criminal when all she'd done was answer his questions honestly. That she was now praising his sensitive touch represented such a complete reversal of position that it could only be explained by anxiety. Mrs. Grafton was concerned, and Miss Marple realized that she might be mistaken for the letter's author, perhaps because she had complained so vocally about the inspector's manner, perhaps because she was known to have a sharp tongue and a good education. Miss Marple continued on her way, passing the groups of villagers engaged in their Saturday morning routines. Everywhere she looked, she saw the small signs of unease that the letter had created. People being careful with their words, and people defending those they would normally criticize. People watching one another with an attention that had nothing to do with ordinary social interest. The anonymous letter had cast a stone into the still pond of village life, and the ripples were spreading in directions the author might never have anticipated. Inspector Slack was attempting to control the narrative through public apologies. Mrs. Ridgeway was worried about being suspected because of her position. Mrs. Grafton was praising the very behavior she had previously condemned. And somewhere, presumably, the actual author of the letter was watching these reactions and wondering whether their warning was being heeded or merely creating chaos. Miss Marple turned into her own gate and made her way to the garden, where she settled into her favourite chair beneath the apple tree. The morning sunshine was warm. A robin was singing nearby with all the confidence of established territory. She thought about Mrs. Ridgeway's nervous fingers on the clasp of her handbag, that small unconscious gesture that had revealed more than words could convey. People's hands often betrayed them, she reflected. The way they touched things, gripped things, worried at things when their minds were elsewhere. And somewhere in St. Mary Me, someone's hands had typed that letter, sealed that envelope, and delivered it in the darkness to the parish letterbox. The question was not only who those hands belonged to, but what they hoped to accomplish beyond the obvious warning, because Miss Marple was becoming increasingly certain that the letter had been written not to punish Inspector Slack, but to protect someone else entirely. Chapter 5. An invitation not meant to be opened. Mrs. Luttrell's birthday gatherings were something of an institution in St. Mary Me, occupying a position midway between formal social obligation and genuine pleasure. She was a widow of independent means, who lived in a handsome house on the corner of the High Street and Church Lane, and she had celebrated her birthday on the 3rd Saturday of May for as long as anyone could remember, with a garden party that included tea, cake, and a carefully curated selection of guests. This year's gathering fell exactly 1 week after the anonymous letter had arrived at the vicarage, and Miss Marple, accepting her invitation with the usual expressions of pleasure, and had wondered whether the occasion might prove illuminating. There was nothing quite like a social gathering for revealing the tensions that lay beneath polite conversation, and she suspected that Mrs. Luttill's party would be no exception. The afternoon was perfect for such an event. With mild sunshine and a gentle breeze, that stirred the ribbons on the ladies' hats without threatening to disarrange them entirely. Mrs. Luttrell's garden was looking particularly fine, with late tulips still blooming in the borders, and the roses just beginning to show colour. Small tables had been arranged on the lawn, and a larger table under the oak tree held an impressive array of sandwiches, scone, and the birthday cake itself, a magnificent creation from the bakery in Much Bainham. Miss Marple arrived at 3 when the party was already well established. Yes, she observed with interest that Inspector Slack was present, which was unusual in itself, and the inspector did not generally attend village social functions unless required by duty, and there was nothing dutiful about his presence here. He stood near the refreshment table, teacup in hand, engaged in conversation with Colonel Pitherbridge, and nodding with what appeared to be genuine interest at whatever the Colonel was saying about his alias. "Extraordinary, isn't it?" murmured a voice at Miss Marple's elbow. She turned to find Miss Calthorpe, elegant in dove grey, and observing the same scene. "I cannot recall the last time I saw Inspector Slack at a purely social function. He appears to be making quite an effort to be agreeable." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, though one wonders whether the effort itself might defeat the purpose. Miss Calthorpe's lips quirked in what might have been amusement. "Quite so. There is something rather studied about his congeniality, isn't there? As though he's following a script rather than engaging naturally." And they collected their tea and found seats at one of the smaller tables, from which vantage point they could observe the gathering without appearing to do so too obviously. Mrs. Bantry was holding court near the roses, regaling a captive audience with some story that involved considerable gesticulation. Mrs. and Price Ridley was examining the flower arrangements with the concentrated attention of someone who wishes to appear absorbed in order to avoid conversation, and young Tommy Mills was serving sandwiches with the awkward dignity of youth pressed into service. "Have you noticed," Miss Callop said quietly, "how carefully people are spacing themselves today? Mrs. Grafton and Mrs. Finch would normally be together, yet they've positioned themselves at opposite ends of the garden. And Dr. Haddock, who usually engages Inspector Slack in spirited debate about everything from politics to proper drainage, seems to be avoiding him entirely." Miss Marple had noticed. The gathering had the quality of a chess game, with each piece carefully positioned to avoid certain encounters, while maintaining the appearance of casual arrangement. It was the social manifestation of the unease that had gripped the village since the letter's arrival, and Mrs. Luttrell herself appeared blissfully unaware of these undercurrents, or perhaps she simply chose to ignore them. She moved among her guests with gracious pleasure, accepting compliments on her garden and her cake with equal modesty. When she reached Miss Marple's table, she paused to chat about the recent fine weather and the upcoming church fete. "I do hope you'll be managing the White Elephant stall again this year, Miss Marple. You have such a gift for it." "I should be delighted," Miss Marple assured her, "though I fear my contributions to the stall itself will be rather modest this year. One accumulates less as one grows older, I find." Mrs. Luttrell laughed and moved on, and Miss Marple watched as she approached Inspector Slack with the same warm hospitality she offered to everyone. The inspector straightened slightly, setting down his teacup to accept a slice of cake with visible pleasure and what appeared to be genuine gratitude, and the afternoon progressed pleasantly enough, with the usual circulation of guests and exchange of small talk. Miss Marple spoke with several villagers, noting as she did so the careful way conversations avoided certain topics. No one mentioned the anonymous letter, though it hung over the gathering like morning mist. No one criticized the inspector, though several found occasion to praise him for minor virtues, and everyone seemed slightly more alert than such occasions normally required, as though waiting for something to happen. It was during the presentation of Mrs. Luttrell's birthday gifts that the peculiar incident occurred. The gifts had been arranged on a side table in the drawing room, and Mrs. Luttrell was opening them one by one with appropriate exclamations of delight. Miss Marple, who had drifted indoors with several other guests, stood near the window, observing the proceedings. Mrs. Bantry had given a lovely shawl. Colonel Petherbridge had contributed a book on English gardens. Dr. Haydock's gift was a bottle of excellent sherry. And then Mrs. Luttrell reached for what appeared to be a card in a cream-coloured envelope, her name written across it in an elegant hand. "Oh, how lovely," she said, beginning to open it. "I don't recognise the handwriting," but she stopped abruptly, her expression shifting from pleasure to confusion. "How odd. This isn't addressed to me at all. It says Miss Calthorpe on the card itself. I can't think how it ended up among my gifts." Miss Calthorpe, who had been standing near the fireplace, went very still. The colour of the envelope, Miss Marple noticed, was almost identical to the cream-coloured writing paper that Miss Calthorpe herself used for correspondence. She'd seen such paper in the stationers in Much Bainham, a particular shade that was distinctive without being ostentatious. "How strange," Miss Calthorpe said, her voice carefully controlled. "I didn't bring a gift, Mrs. Luttrell. I sent flowers earlier in the week, as you know." "Of course you did, dear, and they were beautiful. This must be some sort of mix-up." Mrs. Luttrell examined the envelope more closely. "There's no other name on it, just yours on the card. Perhaps someone meant to give it to you and placed it on the wrong table by mistake." The moment passed quickly, with Mrs. Luttrell setting the mysterious envelope aside and moving on to the next gift. But Miss Marple had observed Miss Callop's reaction with considerable interest. It had not been surprise at receiving an unexpected gift, nor puzzlement at the error. It had been something closer to alarm, swiftly controlled, but unmistakable to anyone watching carefully. The colour of the envelope had startled her, and in that startled reaction, Miss Marple had glimpsed recognition. After the gift opening concluded, the guests filtered back into the garden, and Miss Marple found herself walking beside Miss Calthorpe toward the refreshment table, and she remarked casually, "That was rather an odd little mystery with the envelope. One wonders how such a mix-up could occur." Miss Calthorpe's expression was composed, but a voice held a note of something that might have been carefully suppressed emotion. "Indeed, though I suppose at a gathering of this size, such confusions are inevitable. Someone likely brought a card for me, thinking I would be present, and then forgot about it among the birthday gifts. You use cream-coloured stationery yourself, I believe. Rather a distinctive shade." "I do." Miss Calthorpe paused, then added with deliberate precision, "Though I am certainly not the only person in the village who does. That particular paper is available at the station as in Much Bainham. Anyone might purchase it." There was a warning in those words, gentle but clear. Miss Marple recognised it for what it was, a request not to pursue this particular line of inquiry in public. "Lynn," she inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement and changed the subject to the upcoming church fete. But as the afternoon drew to a close and guests began making their farewells, Miss Marple reflected on what she had observed. The cream-coloured envelope had triggered a reaction in Miss Calthorpe that suggested association, memory, perhaps even guilt. Not the guilt of wrongdoing, but the more complicated guilt of secrets kept and decisions made that might have consequences beyond one's original intentions. She thought about the anonymous letter, typed on good paper and delivered by hand. She thought about Miss Calthorpe's visit to her drawing room days earlier, with its carefully worded observations about truth and direct address being better than anonymous suggestion. She thought about the former school teacher's intelligence, her discretion, and her access to a typewriter that would have been standard equipment in any school. And she thought about the way small things could reveal large truths. A nervous hand on a handbag clasp, a startled response to a particular shade of cream, the associations that people formed between objects and actions, connections invisible to most, but meaningful to those who knew how to observe. Walking home through the lengthening shadows, Miss Marple considered the possibility that had been forming in her mind since Miss Calthorpe's first visit. The anonymous letter might not have been written out of malice or revenge. It might have been written by someone who cared deeply about justice, but who also valued the dignity of all involved, even those who had erred. Someone who understood that warnings could be acts of kindness if delivered with the right intent. Someone perhaps who had spent 30 years teaching children that there were consequences to one's actions, but that reform was always possible for those willing to see their own faults. The question was whether that someone had anticipated how thoroughly their careful warning would disturb the very peace they sought to preserve. Chapter 6. The detail the fishmonger overlooked. Monday morning brought with it the sort of soft rain that felt more like mist than proper precipitation, and the kind that dampened everything without appearing to fall at all. Miss Marple stood at her drawing-room window watching the droplets collect on the glass, her mind occupied less with the weather than with the accumulating observations of the past week. The anonymous letter, Miss Calthorpe's startled reaction to the cream-coloured envelope, Inspector Slack's performances of reformed behaviour. All these pieces were beginning to form a pattern, and though the complete picture remained tantalisingly out of focus. She had learned long ago that the solution to most puzzles lay not in dramatic revelations, but in patient accumulation of small truths. One observed, one listened, one remembered, and eventually the pieces arranged themselves into something comprehensible. The difficulty was knowing which details mattered, and which were merely decorative distractions. The Morning Post brought nothing of interest, and Miss Marple occupied herself with correspondence until the rain cleared around midday, giving way to watery sunshine that made the wet pavements gleam like polished silver. She decided to take a brief constitutional, as much for the opportunity to observe the village's Monday routines as for the exercise itself. Her route took her past the fishmonger shop, where Mr. Elby was arranging his display with the meticulous care he brought to all his professional endeavours. He was a compact, an energetic man of perhaps 45. Yantan, with the permanently ruddy complexion of someone who spent considerable time in coal storage rooms, and he took great pride in the quality and freshness of his stock. His shop was immaculately maintained, his marble counter scrubbed white, and his ice bed perfectly arranged to show each fish to best advantage. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he called cheerfully as she approached. "Lovely to see a bit of sun after this morning's drizzle. Can I interest you in some very fine place? Just came in this morning." "How tempting, Mr. Elby, though I think not today. I had fish on Saturday, and Agnes has her heart set on preparing a chicken for tonight's dinner." Miss Marple paused by the shop front, admiring the display. "Your arrangements always look so professional. You must take considerable satisfaction in your work." Mr. Elby beamed at the compliment. "Well, I do try, Miss Marple. A fish properly displayed sells itself. That's what my father always said, though of course it helps to have good stock to begin with. I'm very particular about my suppliers. They chatted for a few moments about the relative merits of various fishing ports, and then, as though the thought had just occurred to her, Miss Marple remarked, "I don't suppose you recall anything unusual happening around the shop last week, Tuesday perhaps, or early Wednesday?" Mr. Elby frowned thoughtfully. "Unusual in what way, Miss Marple?" "Oh, I hardly know myself. Perhaps someone asking for something out of the ordinary or behaving a bit oddly. I'm trying to help Reverend St. Aldwyn with a small matter, and I thought you might have noticed something." "Well, now you mention it." Mr. Elby set down the fish he'd been arranging and gave the matter his full attention. "There was something a bit curious on Tuesday afternoon. I'd forgotten all about it until just now, but yes, I had a customer who asked to borrow some brown wrapping paper and tape. Said they needed to wrap a book they were sending to a friend as a gift." Miss Marple's interest sharpened, though her expression remained merely politely curious. How unusual. Did they purchase anything? That's what struck me as odd at the time. They didn't buy a thing, just asked if they could have a bit of paper and tape for this book parcel. Said they'd be happy to pay for it. I gave them what they needed. Wasn't much, and he's just a sheet of brown paper and a few inches of tape. And they thanked me and left. Didn't charge them anything, of course. It was such a small amount. Do you remember who it was? Mr. Elb's expression became apologetic. That's the thing, Miss Marple. I'm not entirely certain. It was a busy afternoon, and I was serving several customers at once. I have an impression of someone rather well-spoken, wearing a good coat, but I couldn't swear to the identity. Could have been one of several people, really. Was it a man or a woman? He considered this carefully. A woman, I think. Yes, definitely a woman. But beyond that, he shrugged helplessly. I'm sorry I can't be more specific. Is it important? Perhaps not, Miss Marple said gently. Though it is interesting that someone would need wrapping materials for a book, but wouldn't purchase anything from your shop while they were here. One would think they might have taken the opportunity to buy fish if they were already making a special trip. I thought that myself at the time. Mr. Elby admitted struck me as a bit peculiar. But people do odd things sometimes, don't they? Perhaps they had already done their marketing for the week, and the book wrapping was an afterthought. Miss Marple thanked him and continued her walk, but her mind was working rapidly. Brown wrapping paper and tape for a book parcel, and the same materials one might use to disguise a letter as a more innocent package, to make it look like something ordinary that could be placed in a parish letterbox without attracting attention. Someone had approached the Fishmonger, one of several shops in the village where such materials might be obtained without causing comment, and borrowed what they needed with a plausible explanation. A book for a friend, the sort of thing anyone might do, casual and innocent, and entirely unmemorable, except that no book had been purchased at the shop, which suggested the wrapping materials had been obtained under false pretenses, and the timing, Tuesday afternoon, the same day the letter had appeared in the parish box, was suggestive indeed. Miss Marple made her way slowly toward home, her route taking her past the church, where Mr. Pollock the Vere was sweeping the path. He was a methodical man who attended the church grounds for 20 years, and he greeted her with his usual reserved courtesy. Good afternoon, Mr. Pollock. The church is looking very well maintained as always. Thank you, Miss Marple. We do our best. He paused in his sweeping. Though I must say, there's been a bit more traffic through the churchyard lately. People using the path as a shortcut, I think, rather than walking around by the high street. Has there indeed? That seems rather inconsiderate. Oh, I don't mind during the day. It's a public path after all. But I did notice some footprints near the parish letterbox on Wednesday morning when I came to empty it. Fresh prints in the soft earth beside the box, as though someone had stood there recently. Made me wonder if someone had been posting notices late at night. How curious. Could you tell anything about the footprints? Whether they were from a man's boot or a woman's shoe, perhaps? Mr. Pollock considered this. Couldn't say for certain, Miss Marple. They weren't very clear, and the night dew had blurred them somewhat. But they seemed rather small, I'd say. Could have been a woman or a man with small feet. Or a young person. He resumed his sweeping. Probably nothing to concern ourselves with. Just someone posting a prayer request after hours, I expect. Miss Marple continued homeward, her thoughts assembling the pieces with greater clarity. Someone, most likely a woman, had obtained wrapping materials from the Fishmonger on Tuesday afternoon, and someone had approached the parish letterbox after dark, leaving footprints in the soft earth. Someone had placed the anonymous letter among the usual notices, disguised perhaps in brown paper to look like a book or pamphlet, rather than a simple envelope. The question was why such elaborate precautions had been necessary. If one meant to send an anonymous warning, why not simply drop the letter in the regular post with no return address? Why risk approaching the parish box after dark where one might be seen? The answer, she thought, was because the author wanted to ensure the letter reached the vicar directly without passing through Mrs. Ridgeway's hands at the post office. Perhaps out of consideration for Mrs. Ridgeway's position, perhaps to avoid creating a postal record that might be traced, or perhaps because the author knew that hand delivery to the parish box would itself send a message. This is local, and this is personal. This matters to our community. Back in her drawing room, Miss Marple took up her knitting and worked several rows, while her thoughts continued their methodical progress. She thought about Miss Calthorpe's intelligence and her access to a typewriter at the school. She thought about the cream-coloured stationery and the startled reaction to the envelope at Mrs. Luttrell's party. She thought about a woman with a good coat and a well-spoken manner borrowing wrapping paper for a book that didn't exist. And she thought about the essential kindness that underlay the entire enterprise. For if her suspicions were correct, the anonymous letter had not been written to destroy Inspector Slack's reputation, but to preserve it, to offer him one last chance to recognize his own failings and correct them before someone less charitable brought them to public attention. It was in its way an act of considerable moral courage to risk exposure and censure in order to prevent greater harm, to write what needed to be said without claiming credit or demanding recognition, to trust that the warning itself would be sufficient without requiring enforcement. The difficulty was that warnings, however kindly meant, could produce unintended consequences. They could create anxiety in the innocent, and defensive reactions in the guilty and general unease in everyone who wondered whether they might somehow be implicated. They could transform a simple correction into a village-wide disturbance that affected far more people than originally intended. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily as the afternoon light began to fade. She had not yet gathered enough evidence to be absolutely certain of her conclusions, but the pattern was becoming increasingly clear. The remaining question was whether she should share her deductions with the person concerned, or whether it would be kinder to allow the matter to resolve itself naturally. Sometimes, she reflected, the wisest course was simply to ensure that the right people arrived at the truth in their own time, with gentle guidance rather than direct confrontation. The letter's author had chosen discretion over drama, and perhaps that example ought to be followed, but there was still the matter of understanding fully what had prompted such a letter in the first place. What pattern of behaviour had Miss Calthorpe, if indeed it was Miss Calthorpe, observed that required such intervention? What old wounds had been reopened? What injustices remembered? What fears for the future contemplated? But those questions would require answers before the matter could truly be considered resolved. And Miss Marple suspected that the answers lay somewhere in the past, in events that had occurred before the letter was ever written. In stories, she thought, that had not yet been fully told. Chapter 7. The Edge of the Table Linen. Tuesday afternoon found Miss Marple engaged in one of those pleasant social obligations that punctuated village life with agreeable regularity. Mrs. Price Ridley had invited her to tea, ostensibly to discuss arrangements for the church fete, but more probably, Miss Marple suspected, because Mrs. Price Ridley was one of those people who found recent events disturbing and wished to discuss them with someone who might provide perspective without judgment. The Price Ridley house was one of the larger establishments in St. Mary Me, a comfortable Victorian villa with well-tended gardens and an air of prosperous respectability. Mrs. Price Ridley herself was a woman of firm opinions and generous impulses, and though she would have been surprised to learn that the latter sometimes overshadowed the former. She greeted Miss Marple with genuine warmth and led her into the drawing room, where tea had been laid with the sort of attention to detail that suggested the hostess valued ceremony. The room was familiar to Miss Marple from previous visits, and she noted with approval that the spring flowers in the vases had been recently refreshed, and that the silver tea service gleamed with proper care. Mrs. Price Ridley poured tea with practiced efficiency and offered a plate of delicate sandwiches before settling into her chair with an expression that suggested she had been waiting for this opportunity. "I'm so glad you could come, Miss Marple. I've been meaning to have a proper conversation with you for days now, but one never seems to find the right moment at church or in the shops. How kind of you to think of me. And your garden is looking particularly lovely. The tulips are magnificent, and they exchange pleasantries about gardens and weather for a few minutes. But Miss Marple could see that Mrs. Price Ridley's thoughts were elsewhere. Eventually, as Miss Marple had anticipated, the conversation turned to the matter that was occupying most of the village's attention. This business with the anonymous letter, Mrs. Price Ridley said, setting down her teacup with a firmness that suggested decision. It's created such an uncomfortable atmosphere, hasn't it? People behaving oddly, looking at each other with suspicion. I find it all rather distressing. These things do tend to have a disruptive effect, Miss Marple agreed gently. The thing is, I keep thinking about something that happened years ago. I wonder whether it might be connected, or whether I'm simply remembering old troubles because of present anxieties. Mrs. Price Ridley smoothed the edge of the tablecloth with nervous fingers, a gesture that reminded Miss Marple of Mrs. Ridgeway's worried clasp on her handbag. It was before you came to live here permanently, I believe, about 15 years ago during Miss Calthorpe's tenure at the school. Miss Marple's attention sharpened, though her expression remained merely interested. Oh yes, there was an incident involving one of the pupils, a girl from a respectable family, though not a wealthy one. She was accused of taking money from the headmistress's desk. Small amounts, nothing significant, but theft nonetheless. Mrs. Price Ridley paused, her fingers still working at the tablecloth's edge. Inspector Slack was called in to investigate. He was relatively new to the position then, and I think he felt he needed to demonstrate his authority. What happened? He questioned the girl quite harshly. I understand, in front of other students, which made it all the more humiliating. The poor child was reduced to tears, and her parents were mortified. It turned out in the end that the money hadn't been stolen at all. The headmistress had simply miscounted and misplaced it in another drawer. A simple accounting error, nothing more. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. That must have been very difficult for everyone involved. It was. But what made it worse was that Inspector Slack never properly apologized to the girl or her family. Oh, he said something perfunctory about being glad it was sorted out, but there was no acknowledgement of the harm his heavy-handed approach had caused, and the girl left the school shortly afterward. Her family moved away, said they couldn't bear the shame of it all, though there was nothing shameful about her behavior, only about the way she'd been treated. I imagine Miss Calthorpe must have found that particularly troubling given her position. She did indeed. She spoke to the inspector privately. I know because my sister happened to overhear part of the conversation. Miss Calthorpe told him that authority without compassion was merely tyranny in miniature, and that a child's dignity was worth more than a policeman's pride. Mrs. Price Ridley's expression held both admiration and sadness. The inspector didn't take it well, as you might imagine. He told her to mind her own business and let him handle police matters. Miss Marple set down her teacup, and Miss Calthorpe said nothing further. Not publicly, no, but I've always thought she never forgot it. She's that sort of person, isn't she? She remembers injustices, even small ones, because she believes that small injustices matter just as much as large ones, perhaps more because people are quicker to overlook them. They sat in silence for a moment, and Miss Marple reflected on this new information, an incident from 15 years ago, involving a child wrongly accused and a teacher who had tried to defend that child's dignity. It explained much about Miss Calthorpe's character, or impossibly about her motivation for writing the anonymous letter, if indeed she had written it. But there was more to the story, Miss Marple sensed. Mrs. Price Ridley was not finished. The reason I mention it, Mrs. Price Ridley continued, is because I've seen the same pattern repeat itself several times since then. Not with children, thankfully, but with adults who happen to be less powerful or well-connected than others. Mr. Breyer and the poaching accusation was only the most recent example, and there was also a matter involving one of the maids at Colonel Petherbridge's house, who was questioned about a missing brooch. She was innocent, of course, but the way Inspector Slack handled it made her feel like a criminal. She left her position and went to work in Much Benham, rather than stay in a village where she'd been treated so shabbily. Has no one ever challenged him about this pattern? How does one challenge an inspector of police? He has the authority, and most people are afraid of seeming obstructive or guilty themselves if they question his methods too directly. Mrs. Price Ridley's voice held frustration. That's why I found myself wondering whether this anonymous letter might be someone's way of addressing the problem without risking direct confrontation. A warning, as it were, that his behavior has been noticed and needs to change. Miss Marple considered her hostess with renewed appreciation. Mrs. Price Ridley might present herself as primarily concerned with social proprieties and village gossip, but beneath that exterior lay a genuine concern for justice and a clearer understanding of human dynamics than she was usually credited with. You speak as though you think the letter might have been justified, Miss Marple observed. So I think Mrs. Price Ridley chose her words carefully. I think that sometimes people in positions of authority need to be reminded that their power affects real lives in real ways. And I think that if someone felt strongly enough to write such a letter, they probably had good reasons, though whether it will do any good is another matter entirely. She reached for the teapot to refill their cups, and as she did so, her hand brushed the edge of the tablecloth, adjusting it with an absent precision that suggested long habit. Had Miss Marple watched the gesture and thought about all the small ways people tried to maintain order in their lives, smoothing tablecloths, arranging flowers, keeping gardens tidy, the external order that reflected, or perhaps compensated for the more complicated disorder of human relationships and moral questions. "Did you know," Miss Marple said quietly, "that sometimes the kindest thing one can do for another person is to tell them a truth they don't wish to hear? Not cruelly, but clearly, not to punish, but to prevent further harm." Mrs. Price Ridley met her eyes. "I do know that, though. It's a difficult thing to do, isn't it? Especially when one risks being accused of malice or interference. Very difficult. It requires both courage and compassion. One must be certain that one's motives are pure, and that the potential benefit outweighs the certain discomfort. You sound as though you're speaking from experience." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I am old enough to have experienced many things, my dear, and I have learned that the people who take on difficult tasks out of genuine concern for others rarely receive credit for their efforts, and more often they receive criticism and suspicion, but they do what must be done nonetheless, because their conscience requires it." They finished their tea in companionable quiet, and when Miss Marple rose to leave, Mrs. Price Ridley walked her to the door with visible relief, and it was clear that sharing her memories of the incident from 15 years ago had eased some burden she had been carrying. "Thank you for listening, Miss Marple. I wasn't certain whether I should mention all that old business, but I felt it might be relevant to understanding the present situation." "It was very relevant indeed," Miss Marple assured her, "and very generous of you to share it." Walking home through the afternoon sunshine, Miss Marple reflected on patterns, both the patterns of behaviour that Inspector Slack had established over many years, and the patterns of response that such behaviour provoked. She thought about a young girl humiliated in front of her schoolmates, a maid forced to leave her position, a caretaker wrongly suspected of theft, individual incidents, perhaps minor in the grand scheme of things, but collectively they painted a picture of someone who wielded authority without sufficient regard for its impact on others. And she thought about Miss Calthorpe, who had witnessed that first incident and had spoken up privately, only to be rebuffed, who had watched the pattern continue over 15 years, who had finally decided that private remonstrance had failed and that a different approach was needed, not to punish Inspector Slack, but to warn him, to give him one last opportunity to recognize his own failings and correct them before someone less charitable, or before some more serious incident brought matters to a crisis that could not be so easily managed. It was, Miss Marple thought, exactly the sort of thing a teacher would do, a final warning before more serious consequences, a chance for reform before punishment became necessary. The question now was whether the inspector was capable of learning the lesson he was being taught, or whether his pride would prevent him from seeing the truth that was being offered to him with such careful discretion, and whether Miss Marple herself had any role to play in helping him toward that understanding. Chapter 8. Lessons Learned on the Schoolhouse Steps. The old schoolhouse stood at the edge of St. Mary Me, a solid brick building that had served the Ville's educational needs for nearly a century, before being replaced by a newer, more modern structure on the other side of the green. It had been closed for 5 years now, its windows shuttered, and its playground given over to wild flowers and wandering cats. But it retained a certain dignity in its abandonment, as though waiting patiently for some new purpose to be discovered. Miss Marple had walked past it countless times without giving it particular thought, but on Wednesday afternoon she found herself drawn to it with a sense of purpose that had been building since her conversation with Mrs. Price Ridley, and there was something about the place that seemed to hold answers, or if not answers precisely, then at least the proper context for understanding the questions. The afternoon was fine with high clouds scudding across a pale blue sky and a breeze that carried the scent of growing things. Miss Marple made her way along the lane, her walking stick tapping companionably against the pavement, and turned through the gap in the hedge where the schoolyard gate had once hung. The gate itself had been removed when the building was closed, but the stone posts remained, standing like sentries at an abandoned post. The playground was smaller than she remembered, as such places often seemed when viewed through adult eyes. What had once been neatly marked boundaries for games had become indistinct, the painted lines long since worn away. A climbing frame rusted quietly in one corner, and the steps leading up to the main entrance showed cracks where frost and neglect had done their work. She stood for a moment, listening to the silence and thinking about all the children who had passed through this place over the years. Their voices, their laughter, their tears, all gone now, absorbed into memory and the general passage of time. But the building itself remained, holding its history within its walls like secrets waiting to be acknowledged. Miss Marple made her way to the schoolroom steps and settled herself carefully on the second one, her back against the railing. From here, she could see across the playground to the lane beyond, and she imagined Miss Calthorpe standing in this very spot all those years ago, watching her pupils come and go, noting their small triumphs and disappointments, teaching them not just reading and arithmetic, but how to conduct themselves with dignity in a world that did not always treat them fairly. As she thought about the girl who had been accused of theft, reduced to tears in front of her classmates. How old would she have been? 10 perhaps, or 11. Old enough to understand shame, but too young to defend herself against adult authority. And Miss Calthorpe had stood here, or somewhere near here, and watched it happen, powerless to prevent the inspector's harsh questioning, but determined to speak up afterward, even knowing that her intervention might be unwelcome, and the sound of footsteps on gravel interrupted her reflections. She looked up to see Miss Calthorpe herself approaching along the lane, pausing when she caught sight of Miss Marple sitting on the steps. For a moment, neither woman spoke, and then Miss Calthorpe came forward with a slight smile. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect to find anyone here. This place is usually quite deserted." "I was indulging in a bit of reminiscence," Miss Marple said, "though I confess my memories of this building are far less vivid than yours must be. You spent many years here, didn't you?" 30 years. Miss Calthorpe's gaze travelled across the playground with an expression that mingled fondness and melancholy. It seemed strange to see it so neglected. "I know the new school is far superior in every practical way, but this place had character. May I?" Miss Marple gestured to the step beside her, and Miss Calthorpe settled herself there with the unconscious ease of someone who had climbed these steps thousands of times. They sat in companionable silence for a few moments, and then Miss Marple said gently, "I heard about the incident with the young girl, the one who was accused of taking money." Miss Calthorpe's hands, which had been resting loosely in her lap, tightened slightly. I wondered whether someone would mention that. "Mrs. is Price Ridley, and I suppose she remembered it because she thought it might help explain the present situation." "Did she?" It was not a question. Miss Calthorpe looked out across the playground, her profile calm, but her eyes distant. That was one of the most difficult days of my teaching career, not because of what happened, though that was bad enough, but because of my own helplessness in the face of it. The girl was called Sarah Wilmot, a bright child, conscientious from a respectable but not prosperous family. When the headmistress discovered money missing from her desk, Inspector Slack was called in immediately. He questioned the child here at the school in the headmistress's office, but with the door open and other children nearby. He was convinced she was guilty because she'd been the last one in that corridor before the money disappeared. He didn't raise his voice exactly, but his manner was intimidating. He told her that if she confessed immediately, things would go easier for her. That lying would only make her punishment worse. Miss Calthorpe's voice held the careful neutrality of someone describing events that still had the power to wound. The poor child couldn't stop crying. She kept saying she hadn't taken anything, but he persisted. Finally, the headmistress intervened and suggested they search Sarah's desk and belongings and found nothing, I assume. Nothing at all, because as it transpired, the money was exactly where the headmistress had put it. In a different drawer than she remembered. She'd made a mistake in her accounting, nothing more. But by then, the damage was done. Sarah had been humiliated in front of her peers, her character questioned, her honesty doubted by a figure of authority. Miss Marple nodded slowly, and Inspector Slack's response. He shrugged it off, said these things happened in investigations. No harm done and left. No apology to Sarah. No acknowledgement that his approach had been unnecessarily harsh, or that he might have handled the situation with more sensitivity. Miss Calthorpe's jaw tightened. I spoke to him afterward privately, told him that he had damaged a child's trust in the very people meant to protect her, and that such damage could not be undone with a casual dismissal. What did he say? He told me I was too soft-hearted for my own good, that police work required firmness, and that children needed to learn there were consequences for wrongdoing. I pointed out that Sarah hadn't done anything wrong, and he said that was beside the point. The principle remained the same. She paused, and when she continued, her voice was quieter. I realized then that he genuinely didn't understand. He saw his authority as more important than the people it was meant to serve. And I knew even then that this wouldn't be an isolated incident. And it wasn't. No. Over the years, I saw the pattern repeat. Different people, different circumstances, but always the same essential problem. Inspector Slack approaching situations with the presumption of guilt rather than the presumption of innocence, using his position to intimidate rather than to investigate fairly, and always being too proud to acknowledge when he had made an error. Miss Marple watched a sparrow hopping across the old playground, pecking at something in the grass. The 15 years is a long time to carry such concerns. Yes. Miss Calthorpe's voice was barely above a whisper. But what was I to do? Complain to his superiors? On what grounds? He never did anything technically unlawful. Make a public fuss? That would only have embarrassed the people he'd already humiliated, forcing them to relive their experiences. So I said nothing. I watched and I worried, and I hoped that somehow he would come to see his errors himself. But he didn't. No. And then came the business with Mr. Breyer this past winter, and I thought. She stopped, drew a breath. I thought, here it is again. Another good person treated carelessly by someone who should know better. And I realized that my silence over all these years hadn't been discretion or kindness. It had been cowardice. The word hung between them, stark and unforgiving. Miss Marple said nothing, allowing the confession to settle. I told myself, Miss Calthorpe continued, that if I couldn't speak openly, if I was still too much a coward for that, then perhaps I could at least offer a warning, one final chance for him to recognize what he was becoming. Not a public accusation, not revenge, just a clear statement that his behavior had been noticed and that it needed to change. She turned to look at Miss Marple directly. "I suppose you've already worked out that I wrote the letter?" I had formed that suspicion. "Yes. Are you going to tell people?" Miss Marple considered the question carefully. "Yet that depends, I think, on what you hope to accomplish now. The letter has been written and delivered. Inspector Slack has certainly received its message. Whether or not he's chosen to understand it properly, the question is whether anything more needs to be done, or whether the matter should be allowed to resolve itself quietly." Miss Calthorpe looked down at her hands. "I'm not certain I know the answer to that. I thought the letter would be simple, a warning, nothing more. But it's created such disturbance in the village. People are anxious, suspicious. I never meant for that to happen." "Warnings rarely produce simple results," Miss Marple observed. "They force people to examine their consciences, and that examination makes them uncomfortable. Some respond with genuine reflection. Others respond with defensiveness or displaced anxiety. You cannot control how people react to truth, however gently it's offered." "Then what would you advise?" Miss Marple rose slowly, eyes steadying herself with her walking stick. "I would advise patience. Give the inspector time to absorb what's been said to him, whether he acknowledges it openly or not, and trust that goodness, when it exists in a person, will eventually assert itself over pride." They walked together back along the lane, two elderly women in quiet conversation, while the old schoolhouse settled into its afternoon shadows behind them. At the corner where their paths diverged, Miss Calthorpe paused. "Thank you, Miss Marple, for understanding and for not judging too harshly." "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "I have lived long enough to know that the hardest moral decisions are rarely between good and evil, but between different kinds of good. You chose to speak, even if anonymously, rather than to remain silent. That took courage, whatever the complications that followed." She watched Miss Calthorpe continue on toward her cottage, and then made her own way home through the lengthening shadows, her mind already turning to what might come next. For the lesson from the schoolroom steps had been clear enough, that warnings, however necessary, were only the beginning. What mattered now was whether anyone had truly learned from them. Chapter 9. Knowing when to keep silent. Thursday morning brought with it the sort of clear, bright weather that made ordinary tasks feel almost ceremonial, and Miss Marple spent the earlier part of the morning attending to her correspondence and discussing the week's menus with Agnes. But her thoughts remained occupied with the conversation she needed to have. She had given the matter considerable thought during a somewhat restless night, and had concluded that while Miss Calthorpe's confession had clarified much, there remained one person who deserved to understand the full picture before matters proceeded any further. That person was Reverend St. Hupp Aldwyn. The Vicar had been the letter's recipient after all, and he had carried the burden of its implications with visible distress. He had a right to know the truth. Sirs was not because truth for its own sake required revelation, but because understanding might relieve the anxiety that had troubled him since that Tuesday morning when the letter first arrived. She found him in the vicarage study at 11 o'clock, as she had anticipated, and he was working on his Sunday sermon with the absorbed concentration of a man who found refuge in scholarship, and he looked up with a mixture of relief and apprehension when Agnes showed her in. "Miss Marple, how good of you to call. I was just struggling with a particularly naughty bit of exegesis, and I confess I welcome the interruption." He gestured to a chair. "May I offer you some tea?" "Thank you." "No, I've only just finished my morning cup, but I would appreciate a few moments of your time for a rather delicate conversation." The vicar's expression grew more serious. He set aside his pen and gave her his full attention, and Miss Marple reflected not for the first time that beneath his scholarly diffidence lay a genuine pastoral intelligence. "It's about the anonymous letter," she said without preamble. "I believe I know who wrote it and why, and I thought you should be made aware of the circumstances before deciding how to proceed. And you've discovered the author." The vicar's voice held equal measures of relief and concern. "I'm not certain whether I'm glad or sorry. Knowledge brings its own responsibilities, doesn't it?" "It does indeed, which is why I wanted to discuss the matter with you before taking any further action." Miss Marple settled herself more comfortably in her chair. The letter was written by Miss Calthorpe. She confessed as much to me yesterday afternoon, though I had already formed strong suspicions in that direction. The vicar absorbed this information in silence, his expression thoughtful. "Miss Calthorpe, yes, I can see that now. The phrasing, the care taken with the delivery, the essential, I want to say kindness, though that seems an odd word to apply to an anonymous accusation, but it was kind in its way. That's precisely the point." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Miss Calthorpe wrote that letter not out of malice or revenge, but because she had witnessed a pattern of behavior over many years that troubled her conscience. She tried addressing it privately once, 15 years ago, and was rebuffed. She's watched Inspector Slack treat various villagers with a casual disregard for their dignity, and she finally decided that a warning was necessary before something more serious occurred. The incident with the young girl," the Vicar said slowly. "Mrs. St. Haldwyn mentioned something about that years ago, though I didn't pay it much attention at the time. Children wrongly accused, adults treated with unnecessary harshness. Exactly. None of it illegal, as the letter said, but all of it reflecting poorly on the trust placed in someone with authority over others' welfare." Miss Marple paused, choosing her words carefully. "The question before us now is, what should be done with this knowledge? Miss Calthorpe has already achieved her primary purpose, and the inspector is certainly aware that his behavior has been observed and found wanting. Whether he chooses to reform is of course up to him." The vicar rose and moved to the window, looking out at the garden where spring flowers nodded in the breeze. "You're asking whether I should reveal Miss Calthorpe's identity or confront Inspector Slack directly, or simply let the matter rest. I'm asking what you think serves the greater good, not just the good of the individuals involved, but the good of the community as a whole." He was silent for a long moment, and Miss Marple waited with the patience that had become second nature over many years of observing human nature work itself toward understanding. "When I was a younger man," the vicar said finally, "I believed that truth should always be brought into the light, that secrecy was inherently wrong, and that honesty required full disclosure in all circumstances." He turned to face her. "But I've learned over years of pastoral work that timing matters, that dignity matters, that sometimes the kindest course is to allow people to arrive at truth in their own time, with gentle guidance rather than forced revelation." "A wise conclusion," Miss Marple said softly. "Miss Calthorpe wrote that letter because she cared about justice and about protecting others from careless authority. Exposing her now would punish her for an act of conscience, and would likely embarrass Inspector Slack in a way that would make genuine reform less rather than more likely." He returned to his desk and sat down. "No, I think the better course is to speak with the inspector privately, as I should perhaps have done from the beginning, to help him understand what the letter was truly trying to tell him, without revealing its author or making accusations that would only put him on the defensive. And that seems very sound. Will you come with me?" The question surprised her. "I know it's an unusual request, but I suspect you might be able to help him see things more clearly than I could alone." You have a way of making observations that cut through self-deception without causing offence. Miss Marple considered this. Her first instinct was to decline. It was the vicar's responsibility after all, and she had no official standing in the matter. But then she thought about Inspector Slack's pride, his difficulty in acknowledging error, and the very real possibility that he might dismiss the vicar's gentle counsel as unworldly idealism. "Very well," she said. "Though I think you should be the one to lead the conversation, I shall simply observe and perhaps offer a perspective when appropriate." They found Inspector Slack at the police station, a small brick building next to the town hall that served as his office, an occasional holding cell for minor offenders. He looked up from his paperwork with an expression that shifted rapidly from official courtesy to guarded weariness when he saw his visitors. "Vicer, Miss Marple, this is unexpected. I hope there's no trouble." "No trouble, Inspector, but I wondered whether we might have a private word with you. It concerns the letter that arrived at the vicarage last week." The inspector's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I thought we'd settled that matter. Anonymous nonsense best ignored." "Perhaps," and the vicar said gently, "but I've been thinking about it a great deal, and I've come to believe that whoever wrote it may have had legitimate concerns that deserve to be taken seriously, even if the method of expressing them was unconventional." Inspector Slack pushed back from his desk, his posture defensive. "Are you suggesting there's truth in those vague accusations that I've abused my position?" "I am suggesting," the vicar said, with surprising firmness, "that authority is a sacred trust, and that those of us who hold it must constantly examine whether we're exercising it with appropriate compassion and humility." Miss Marple spoke for the first time. "Inspector, I've lived in St. Mary me long enough to observe how most people regard you. You're seen as competent, diligent, and generally fair in your dealings. But I've also noticed that when you make errors, as all of us do, you have difficulty acknowledging them. The apology you offered Mr. Breyer, for instance, while well-intentioned, came months late, and in such a public manner that it almost seemed designed more for your benefit than his." The inspector's face flushed. "I apologized, didn't I? What more does anyone want? They want to know that you understand why an apology was necessary in the first place." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle but steady. "Not because you were caught in an error, but because you caused harm to someone who deserved better treatment. There's a difference between regret at being wrong and regret at having hurt another person." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken things. Inspector Slack stared at his desk, his hands clenched into fists, and for a moment Miss Marple thought he might order them out of his office. But then gradually the tension in his shoulders eased. "The girl," he said quietly, "the one from the school years ago, Miss Calthorpe, spoke to me about her. I thought she was being oversensitive. I'm making too much of a simple investigation." He looked up, and there was something raw in his expression. "I've thought about that conversation more often than I care to admit. Wondered whether I should have handled things differently." "That wondering is itself a beginning," the vicer said. "But I'm meant to be firm. Police work requires authority, decisiveness. If I start second-guessing every question I ask, every decision I make, I'll be useless at my job. There's a difference," Miss Marple observed, "between being firm and being harsh, between decisive and presumptuous, between authority and arrogance. The letter suggested you'd crossed those lines more than once. Perhaps the real question is whether you're willing to consider that possibility seriously, or whether your pride requires you to dismiss it entirely." Inspector Slack was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its defensive edge. "What would you have me do?" "Reflect. The vicar said simply, "Consider how your actions affect those with less power than yourself. And when you make mistakes, as we all do, acknowledge them promptly and sincerely, without waiting months or making performances of contrition." He paused. "The letter called this your last warning. I choose to interpret that optimistically as a suggestion that reform is still possible. That dignity can be preserved on all sides if you're willing to see clearly and act accordingly." They left him there, he sitting at his desk in silence, and walked together back through the village in the spring sunshine. Neither spoke until they reached the vicarage gate, where the vicar paused and smiled. "Thank you, Miss Marple. That was difficult, but necessary." "Yes," she agreed. "Though the difficulty is far from over, words are only words. What matters now is whether they produce genuine change. We can hope," the vicar said, "and pray and watch. Sometimes that's all we can do." And Miss Marple walked home thinking about warnings and reform, about pride and humility, about the many ways people try to help one another become better versions of themselves. Whether Inspector Slack would learn his lesson remained to be seen, but at least the lesson had finally been taught clearly, with compassion and without cruelty. And sometimes, she reflected, that was enough. Chapter 10. Inspector Slack chooses the longer road home. The days that followed Miss Marple's conversation with Inspector Slack passed with the quiet steadiness that characterized St. Mary Me in late spring. The hedgerows continued their luxuriant growth. The Women's Institute finalized plans for the church fete, and life proceeded with its usual rhythms. But beneath the surface of ordinary routines, small changes were taking place, and changes so subtle that they might have escaped notice had one not been watching carefully. Miss Marple, of course, was watching. She observed that Inspector Slack, when he encountered Mr. Breyer outside the greengrocer's on Friday morning, exchanged a few quiet words with him, and then moved on without any performance of congeniality or forced cheerfulness. Just a brief acknowledgement, Manto Man, and something in Mr. Breyer's posture afterwards suggested that whatever had been said had been well received. She noted that when Mrs. Finch mentioned a minor theft at the bakery, a few coins missing from the till, the inspector's response was measured and methodical. He asked questions, certainly, but his manner lacked the presumptive edge that had characterized his earlier investigations. He spoke with the bakery assistant as though seeking information rather than confirming suspicions already formed, and she observed with particular interest that Inspector Slack had begun taking a different route home in the evenings. Instead of walking directly down the high street to his cottage on the edge of the village, he now followed the longer path that wound through the churchyard, past the old yew trees and the weathered gravestones here, emerging near the lane that led to his door. It was a route that added perhaps 10 minutes to his journey, and Miss Marple wondered whether those 10 minutes were spent in reflection, or simply in the quiet appreciation of surroundings he might previously have hurried past without notice. Either way, the change spoke of something shifting in the inspector's understanding of himself and his place in the community he served. On Saturday afternoon, Miss Marple was working in a garden when she saw Miss Calth walking past along the lane. The former schoolteacher paused at the gate and after a moment's hesitation came up the path. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, Miss Marple. I saw you among your roses and thought I might have a word. You're always welcome, my dear. I was just deadheading these blooms. The warm weather has brought them on beautifully this year." Miss Marple straightened secrets in hand and gestured to the garden bench. "Shall we sit for a moment?" And they settled on the bench where the afternoon sun filtered pleasantly through the apple tree's new leaves. Miss Calther was quiet for a moment, her hands folded in her lap, and when she spoke, her voice carried a note of careful relief. I wanted to thank you for your discretion and for your kindness in helping me understand that warnings, however necessary, create their own complications. Have you noticed any change? Miss Marple asked gently. I have. Small things mostly. The way Inspector Slack conducts himself seems softer somehow, less certain of his own righteousness, perhaps, though I may be seeing what I wish to see rather than what's actually there. I don't think you are. I've observed the same shift. Miss Marple sat down her secrets. Though I suspect the real test will come not in how we handle simple matters, but in how he responds when faced with more challenging situations. Reform is easier to maintain when circumstances are favorable. Miss Calthorpe nodded slowly. I received something yesterday that I wanted to share with you. I found it on my doorstep in the morning, left there sometime during the night. She reached into her pocket and withdrew a small bunch of wild flowers, somewhat wilted now, but still recognizable, primrose and violets, tied with a blade of grass in the simple fashion children might use, or someone who wished to remain anonymous. There was no note, Miss Calthorpe said quietly. But I think I know who left them, and I think I understand what they mean. Miss Marple examined the flowers with gentle approval, an acknowledgement, perhaps, or a thank you, not for the letter itself, but for caring enough to write it. Do you think he knows it was me? I think he may have worked it out, or at least formed strong suspicions, but more importantly, I think he understands now why the letter was necessary. That's what these flowers suggest, not a confession or an accusation, but simply recognition. They sat in comfortable silence, watching a robin hop across the lawn in search of insects. The afternoon held that particular quality of peace that comes when difficult things have been said and understood, when tensions have eased without requiring dramatic resolution. The village seems calmer, Miss Calthorpe observed. People are gossiping again in their usual fashion, which is oddly reassuring. For a while there, everyone was so careful with their words, and so anxious about being suspected of writing the letter or being implicated by it. Now it's as though the whole affair has simply settled. That's the nature of such things, Miss Marple said. They create disturbance for a time, and then, if handled properly, they resolve themselves back into the general flow of village life. A few people may remember, but most will simply move forward, without dwelling on what was, after all, a private matter handled privately. Miss Calthorpe rose to leave, pausing to look at the wildflowers in her hand. I think I'll press these, she said, a reminder that sometimes the hardest truths can be delivered with kindness, and that people are capable of growth, even when we've nearly given up hope of it. After she'd gone, Miss Marple returned to her roses, her thoughts drifting over the events of the past 2 weeks, the anonymous letter that had arrived at the vicarage, the unease it had created, the various reactions it had provoked, and ultimately the understanding it had produced in at least one person who had needed to hear its message. She thought about Sarah Wilmot, the girl who had been questioned so harshly 15 years ago, and wondered where she was now, whether she had recovered from that childhood humiliation, or whether it had left scars that still troubled her, yet whether she knew that someone had remembered her suffering and had finally acted to prevent similar incidents from occurring again. Or probably not, Miss Marple reflected. The girl had left St. Mary Me, and likely never thought of the village except as a place she'd been glad to escape. But perhaps that was all right. Not all acts of justice required the victim's knowledge or gratitude. Sometimes it was enough simply to ensure that patterns of harm were interrupted, that warnings were delivered, that reformation became possible. The sun was beginning to lower toward the horizon when Miss Marple finished with her roses and went inside for tea. Through her drawing-room window, she could see the church tower rising above the rooftops, solid and enduring as it had been for centuries. And she could see, if she looked carefully, the path through the churchyard where Inspector Slack would soon be walking on his way home, taking the long way, as he had done for several days now. 10 extra minutes of reflection and of quiet contemplation, of perhaps considering what it meant to exercise authority with wisdom rather than merely with power. Some people, Miss Marple knew, never learned such lessons. They went through life confident in their own righteousness, never questioning their methods or their impact on others. But others, and she suspected Inspector Slack might be among them, were capable of genuine growth when given the right opportunity. The anonymous letter had provided that opportunity, and not through public shaming or dramatic confrontation, but through a carefully worded warning that left room for dignity and reform. And sometimes, Miss Marple thought as she poured her tea, that was the greatest gift one could offer another person, the chance to become better without losing oneself in the process. She sipped her tea and watched the evening light paint the garden in shades of gold and amber. Well, tomorrow was Sunday, and there would be church services and the usual social exchanges afterward. Life in St. Mary Mead would continue with its gentle rhythms, its small dramas and smaller triumphs. And Inspector Slack would be there, conducting himself with whatever wisdom he had gained from recent events, watched by a community that had always been more observant than it appeared. The kindest warnings, Miss Marple reflected, were indeed the ones that allowed a person to change in peace and to recognize their own failings without having them proclaimed from the rooftops, to reform their behavior without losing the respect of those they served. And as she sat in the gathering dusk, listening to the evening birdsong, and thinking about all the ways people tried to help one another navigate the complicated business of being human, she felt a quiet satisfaction, not because she had solved a mystery in the traditional sense. There had been no crime, no dramatic revelation, and no public vindication of virtue, but because she had witnessed something perhaps more important, the possibility of redemption through understanding, the preservation of dignity through discretion, and the power of words carefully chosen and quietly delivered. Inspector Slack was taking the long way home these days, and in that simple change of routine, in those extra 10 minutes of walking through the churchyard's ancient peace, there lay the hope that warnings could lead to wisdom, and that even the most stubborn pride could eventually give way to genuine humility. Sometimes, Miss Marple thought, that was mystery enough, and solution enough, and grace enough for any village fortunate enough to recognize it. The light faded slowly from the garden, and Miss Marple rose to draw the curtains, content in the knowledge that St. Mary Mead would sleep peacefully tonight, its various dramas resolved not through punishment, but through the gentler mechanisms of conscience, compassion, and the quiet determination of those who cared enough to speak truth with kindness, and that she reflected with a small smile was as it should